D.
Define.
Define the relationship. Yes, in every, this is mainly used in the context of dating. At some point, there's a DTR where you define the relationship. I'll give you an example of how this worked for me and Jen, okay? We were both a part of the same singles group. It was a pretty large church, had a pretty big singles group. So we actually knew of each other for a couple years, but our circles were sort of separate. And then two things kind of caught my eye. First, and probably most importantly, she could really throw the frisbee. Better than any female I have ever seen throw the frisbee. So that was probably most important. And then second, one time we had a church event and we got paired to lead a small group together. And if you've ever been in a small group with my wife, she can lead a small group discussion. And so I was like, I have got to get to know this girl. And so I started, sort of just lingering after events and trying to sort of talk to her some. And then, what was next? Then we both led separate small group Bible studies. And so a couple times I coordinated for our two groups to do stuff together. It was completely self-serving. I was just trying to get to know her. Then one time I gave her a ride home after a church event, and we talked for a long time in the car. At this point, a DTR was definitely needed. My attraction, my interest was clearly, I was showing that, but we hadn't had any clear words on it. So that next Friday, I asked her out, and we have what we call now, we have a 9-hour date of a lifetime. We played multiple sports. We played basketball and frisbee and racquetball. Then we went to dinner, and we ended by sitting around a fire where I pulled out my journal and told her everything I admired about her, and then I asked her if she'd be my girlfriend. You know what she said? No. Why do you laugh at my pain? She said no. And what I didn't tell you is that in the previous 2 years, I had dated 3 other girls in the singles group. And if you've ever been a part of a church singles group, 3 strikes and you're out. I actually resonate with the song, All My Exes Live in Heaven. Yeah. No, she said she didn't want to just fill a spot in my life. She didn't want to just be the next girl. So she said no. And that made me all the more attractive to her. So she said no, I couldn't call her my girlfriend, but we could keep dating, and the rest is history. Every relationship has at least one, if not several, of these DTR kind of conversations. This is how a relationship progresses from dating to engaged, or from being friends to dating. The relationship, this is where the status of the relationship gets discussed, where sort of the trajectory and where the relationship is headed gets talked about in these define the relationship kind of conversations. Well, did you know that Jesus had several DTRs with his disciples? And this morning we're going to look at one of those conversations. To set the context of this conversation, by the time we get to Luke chapter 14, Jesus has huge crowds following him. Not the religious leaders. No, the religious leaders said to Jesus, no, we don't want you. We're not going to follow you. But the people said, we will. And so by the time we get to Luke chapter 14, there's all of these crowds following Jesus. And it's one of those occasions where Jesus speaks to this big crowd and has this define the relationship kind of conversation, where he says to them, okay, if you want to be in a relationship with me, here's what it's going to look like. And as I was thinking about that crowd that's following Jesus, I thought, that's not that different than the crowd that's here in this room this morning. Because in Jesus' crowd, there were some who had been following Jesus for quite a while by this point. The 12 apostles. There was a group of women who followed Jesus around. And some of you have been following Jesus for quite a while. And then there were some in this crowd for whom Jesus was still pretty new. They were sort of just checking Jesus out. What's this Jesus guy all about? And I know there's some of you in here like that too. Whether church is a new experience or whether you've been coming for years, but the whole idea of a relationship with Jesus is still something kind of new, kind of foreign. And Jesus looks at that crowd that has both groups, same as in here this morning, and what he says to them applies to both. Jesus, he's talking to a crowd, but it's almost like he's looking at each of us individually and saying, if you want to be in a relationship with me, if you want to take your relationship with me to the next level, here is what it's going to look like. And so that's the conversation we're going to jump in on. Now, fair warning, Jesus says some things that are really intense. And he says some things that are kind of confusing, in fact, might even be a little bit unsettling. So let's get into it. I want us to wrestle with these words. I want us to sort of dig into the confusing parts, into the intense parts. Let's try to understand the words that Jesus says, but let's not stop there. Then let's spend a few minutes talking about, well, what are we supposed to do with these words? How do we apply these words that we're going to read? So let's not go any further. Let's open up to Luke 14, verses 25 to 35. Let's just read this passage and then we'll get into it. Verse 25. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay a foundation and are not able to complete it or to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, 'This person began to build and wasn't able to finish.' Or suppose a king wants to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciple. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear." Isn't that a great ending? Whoever has ears to hear, let him. I dare you to say that this week sometime, like in a meeting at work or something. Whatever you say, just end it. Whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. I think it's just a good conclusion. Jesus loves that phrase. He says it 6 different times in the Gospels. And he says it whenever he wants to say, hey, what I'm saying is really important. Don't just let it go in one ear and out the other. This is something that you're going to want to respond to. All right, so let's go back. What is the point of what Jesus is trying to say in this DTR kind of conversation? And it starts right out with a bang. I think Jesus really liked the shock value. This would have been just as startling to Jesus' original audience. Verse 26, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple." And I hope you're like, wait a minute. Hate? Jesus says I'm supposed to hate everyone that's close to me? I thought Jesus was all about love. In fact, didn't we just read a few chapters ago in Luke chapter 10 about the Good Samaritan where Jesus says, love your neighbor? So what, we're supposed to love our neighbor but hate our families? How does that work? What's going on here? What Jesus is doing is he's using hate here as a figure of speech. He is exaggerating to make a point. And we do this all the time, actually, with the same word, hate. I'm sure almost on a weekly basis, someone around you says, I hate Tom Brady. Does someone say that? Now, I hope they don't really mean that they hate Tom Brady. But what they mean is they're just sick and tired of the same person winning all the time. Earlier this week, our daughter said, I hate mushrooms. And that's overstated, but it's true. She doesn't care for mushrooms. Jesus' point he's making here, it's one of comparison. He's saying, compared to your love for me, your love for everyone else in your life should be significantly less. He's talking about ranking. He's talking about priority. He's talking about allegiance. He's talking about loyalty. Once we become followers of Jesus, he becomes our first love. And while we still love our families and the other people in our lives, our loyalty to them doesn't even compare to our loyalty to Jesus. That's his point. He's not asking us to hate anyone. He's asking us to rank our loves. And, you know, a great illustration of this is actually in a wedding ceremony. This question you may hear asked of the groom at some point in the wedding. He'll say, do you promise to love her, to comfort her, to honor and keep her for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and health, and forsaking all others, be faithful only to her for as long as you both shall live? Well, what does that forsaking all others mean? Does that mean from that day forward, the groom is supposed to have nothing to do with anyone else? No, it just means now that you're getting married, there's a whole new ballgame. There's a new relationship in your life that trumps all of the others. A new relationship that comes first. It's about focus and priority. And that's what Jesus is saying here. He's saying to be in relationship with me, you need to forsake all of your other alliances and make me your first love, your top priority, the first voice that you listen to. And so of course you serve and you love your family. We're even called to love our enemies on top of that. But if we are ever forced to choose, am I going to do what my parents are telling me, or am I going to do what Jesus is telling me? Am I going to do what my children are telling me to do? Am I going to do what Jesus is telling me to do? Jesus must be the winner of that. So in this DTR conversation, the first thing Jesus says is a relationship with me requires the prime position in our lives. He's not interested in any other position. He's not satisfied just to be one voice among many. That's not the type of relationship he wants. He wants a relationship like the song we just sang, where we say to him, you have no rival. You have no equal. Now, the second thing he says is it won't be easy. Now, to be clear, there are some senses in which a relationship with Jesus is very easy. We don't have to perform our way into Jesus' good graces. We don't need to maintain a high spiritual GPA for us to have a relationship with Jesus. No, we place our faith in him, and by his grace, we are given, his Spirit enters into us and allows us to be in a relationship with Jesus. But Jesus wants to make it perfectly clear that once we do that, that doesn't mean the road becomes smooth and that the struggles in life go away. Actually, the opposite. And especially in that culture, when you start a relationship with Jesus, it means the road's about to get hard. Let me show you what Jesus says, verse 27. Whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Now, I imagine Jesus' first listeners were quite confused by this. I mean, they knew what Roman crucifixion was. They had seen it before. But this whole idea of carrying a cross, this wasn't like a popular phrase. Jesus coined this term, and it wouldn't be until after his death that this would mean really anything at all. But this phrase, especially for later Christians, has a lot packed into it. This phrase means following Jesus isn't easy. It comes with a cost. It's going to take endurance and perseverance. There's going to need to be a willingness to suffer or to be ridiculed or to be lowered in people's minds because of one's connection to Jesus. Jesus knows that whenever we connect our lives to his, at some point, people are going to take issue with that. People are going to get offended. And so when that happens and there's discord or there's isolation or there's abuse, Jesus says, whatever challenges you face by being connected with me, don't bail. Don't just throw in the towel. Don't give up. In spite of how challenging it is, stay the course. Be willing to carry your cross. And friends, that's still true today, isn't it? I mean, if you ever want to polarize a room, if you ever want to sort of stop conversation, just mention the name Jesus. I mean, he is still the most polarizing personality in the course of human history. And Jesus says, this won't be easy. There will be times when what I ask you to do, you will not want to do. But Jesus says, do them anyway. Bear your own cross. I love what Tozer said about this. He said, the true follower of Christ, he will not ask, if I embrace this truth, what will it cost me? Rather, he will say, this is the truth. God, help me to walk in it, let come what may. Otherwise, every time we follow Jesus, and Jesus says, hey, this is what I want you to do, or this is how I want you to be, then we're going to say, well, I'm not sure I want to do that. I'm not sure that's what I want to do right now. But Jesus is saying, no, make that decision early. Make the decision that whatever you say, that's what I'm going to do, regardless of what it costs. So the next slide, this is Jesus' DTR. This is the kind of relationship that Jesus wants. And I kept trying to think, what's a picture for this? You know, Jesus tells us the kind of relationship he desires and the kind of relationship he doesn't want. What's a good picture to help us see that? And I'm going to put up two here for just a second and talk about them. You can go to the next one. Let's talk about the picture on the left for a second. This is sort of campaign season. I don't know if you've been driving around. You're starting to see all sorts of signs in people's yards, especially in the next year when we get into the presidential election. It'll be even more so. But think of how we approach an election. When we approach an election, we ask certain kinds of questions, don't we? We ask, who do I like? Who stands for the things that I stand for? Who's most likely to represent me in the way that I would like to be represented? Who will govern in the way that will bring the best result to me? Who, if I vote for them and things don't start going well, who do I think will be most responsive to my voice? Those are the kinds of questions we ask when choosing a political candidate. And, you know, it doesn't really matter if you're on that side or if you're on that side. It doesn't really matter. But those are the kinds of things we bring to the election process, and it's perfectly okay. But it's all about me, right? Now, look at the picture on the left for a second. This is about 20 years ago, with my parents and my 3 other siblings. The 6 of us are in this boat. We were in Colorado, and we were going down this river that had class 31 rapids. Now, I know there's only 5, but it felt like class 31 rapids. I was sure I was going to die. But I want to tell you about the leadership of that young woman in the back of the boat that day. There was no discussion. There was no election. No, she said to us when we got in the boat, sit down and shut up. And she said, when I say down, you grab your oar, you put it inside the boat, and you hold on to something for dear life. And when I say dig, you take that paddle and you stroke the water as fast as you can until I tell you to stop. Because, folks, it is my intention to get you down the river alive. And the only way that's going to happen is if you listen to me. Now, do you see the difference in the two pictures? There was no democracy in that boat that day. You know, there was no, well, you said dig, but I'm not sure dig is the best option right now. There was none of that. It was just, yes, ma'am. Jesus, he's looking for that sort of following. That's the kind of relationship he wants. Now, Jesus knows that's going to be challenging. There's always going to be occasions where we're going to say, should I? I'm not sure. And, you know, we are living breathing human beings here. And so he's going to mention that there's some barriers that come up when we try to have that kind of relationship with Jesus. And I found it fascinating, the 3 different barriers he mentions. Here's the first one. He says, the people of our world. There's a reason he talks about our family. Every one of us has a clan, has a tribe. And if it's not your biological family, maybe it's the sorority that you went to school with, or the buddies you hang out with, or the ladies at work. There's some collection of people that we hang with, that we take our cues from. And Jesus says, you know, there's going to be all kind of voices into your experience, and that's fine. But don't confuse their voice from my voice. Give my voice preference. You need to transfer your loyalty to me. Now, some of you know this far better than I do. But I'll never forget the time I came home from college. It was during my junior year. And I told my parents, hey, I want to go and live overseas for a year after school and be a part of taking the gospel to the Muslim world. They were not thrilled. Even though they're both believers, even though my dad was a pastor of a church, even though they'd read missionary stories to me my whole life, their fault, but they were not thrilled. So I kind of came to a crossroads. Do I do what my parents want me to do, or do I do what Jesus wants me to do? And I know some of you know that far greater than I do. You've had to come to that crossroads. Am I going to listen to those external voices, or am I going to listen to the voice of Jesus in my life? Now, if that's not bad enough, that sort of external, the people in our world barrier, the internal ones weigh even harder. How about my own ego getting in the way? You know, I'm not the only person who often lives with the mindset that I think I know what's best for me. That's the essence of what sin is. It's this bent that says, you know, God, I can take care of things. I'm really okay on my own, God. I got this handled. And Jesus says we'll have to fight that barrier at every turn, our own ego. C.S. Lewis once said there's only two kinds of people in the world. There's the kinds of people that look up to God and say, thy will be done. And there's the kind of people for whom God looks at them and says, thy will be done. Jesus says, choose to be that first kind of person. Now there's one more barrier that I just want to spend a couple minutes on. He says, watch out to the voices you listen to. Watch out for your own ego. But then he says, watch out also for the stuff that you have. Did you notice that little phrase in verse 33? It says, in the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. You know, most of us, we tend to think that we are what we've accumulated, that we're the position that we have, we're the title that we attach to ourselves, we're the zip code that we live in, we're the possessions we've acquired. And Jesus says, that's a shallow life. He says you need to be able to hold that stuff with an open hand if you're going to follow me. Otherwise, it will own you instead of you owning it. So Jesus says we give it up. Your version may say we renounce it. I'll never forget the time, I was in high school at the time, and I was part of a small group Bible study, and our leader was a guy named Guy, was his name. He had us over his house, and he had got a new Jeep Wrangler. And you can imagine the group of us high school boys were like sort of drooling over this car. And with us all there, he went and got his hammer. I was like, what is he doing? And he took his hammer, and he went to the side door, and he dented his brand new Jeep Wrangler. And he said, the reason I'm doing this is I don't want to ever forget that this is just a thing. That dent is forever now going to remind me this is just a thing. It's never more than that in my heart. This is just a thing. Now don't take hammers and go dent all of your doors this afternoon, unless you need that to help your heart know that it can't own you. Because Jesus says our stuff tries to own us. All right, now we're almost through this passage. Jesus has made his point. He's laid out his DTR. He wants that prime position in our lives, and he says it's not going to be easy. So just know that on the front end. And then he talks about these different barriers that we're going to face. And then he gives these three pictures. You heard me read them earlier. These three metaphors. And these three are all making just one point. He talks about a guy building a tower, a king going to war, and salt losing its saltiness. Now the first two are a little bit more easily understandable. So let's talk about salt losing its saltiness for a second. When you and I see salt, we see it in a shaker on the table. It's already been refined. It's pure. It's pure sodium chloride. And the way that you know that is if you mix it with water, it completely disappears. But that's not what salt was like in Jesus' day. Now, in Jesus' day, it wasn't nearly as refined or pure. In fact, it was a lot more like if some of you lived in a cold climate and they're calling for snow that night. It's a lot more like what they put out on the roads, what are more cinders, where it's this sort of gritty substance that gives traction. And yeah, it has a little bit of salt mixed in, so it has some melting component. But once all that salt melts away, you're just left with this gritty substance, this carrier. All the saltiness is gone. Well, in Jesus' day, that's more what it was like. Salt wasn't pure at all. And so if you left your supply of salt out in the humidity, or if you left it out in the weather and the rain got to it, all the salt vanished, and you were just left with the carriers, these cinders kind of thing, and it was just debris. It wasn't useful at all. You just throw it away. So what is that kind of salt, and a guy who's building a tower, and a king who's going out to war, what do they all have in common? I think here's the point of those three stories. It's great to start out well. But it's really important that you finish well. You know, it's okay if you start a tower, but you better make sure that you have enough to finish that tower. It's okay to go to war, but if you're not going to be able to finish that fight, you do not want to be in the middle of a losing fight and have to negotiate terms of peace. And, you know, it's great to have a bunch of salt, but if it's no good when you actually want to use it, it's not helpful. In other words, Jesus is saying, start well, that's important, but also make sure that you finish well, because that is more important. You know, I'm convinced if Jesus was alive today, he wouldn't tell these three stories. He would tell a different three stories. He'd talk about a grand wedding and this marriage that started amazingly. And then, you know what, over time it drifted and then it ended and they went their separate ways. He would talk about a young law student who passed the bar exam, took a job at a prestigious law firm, and then was disbarred because of some ethical decision. He'd talk about an athlete who was just a rising star and got famous, stopped training, and squandered his talent and was eventually cut from the team. I think Jesus would find all sorts of ways to talk about this. He'd talk about authors who started books but never finished them. He'd say, it doesn't matter how you begin, it matters how you finish. And to this crowd of people, that's not that different than the crowd in here today, Jesus says, I want all of you to be in this kind of relationship with me. And because of grace, it's available to anyone. But he says, I want to tell you what this relationship is going to look like at the beginning so that you don't get into it and realize it's not what you signed up for. This is something you want to finish well. Now, there's lots more we could say about this passage. But let's just take the last couple minutes here to say, what are we supposed to do with this? Whether you've been following Jesus for years and years and years, or whether following Jesus is something new. What are we supposed to take away from this? And I've had just a couple thoughts. The first is that usually the person who initiates the DTR is the one who wants to take the relationship to the next level. Which means Jesus wants more relationship with you than you have at the current moment. He wants it. He is inviting you into that. He's just waiting for us to say, we'll go there. And the way you go there is you say, Jesus, again today, I want you in the prime position of my life. Yeah, there's some other voices I've started listening to. Some ways I've stepped away from that. But I want you in that prime position. And I know it's going to take perseverance, and I know it's going to take endurance. But I want to respond to your invitation. And there's one more thing I want to say to all of us, and that is that there's always time to finish well. You know, this is an active process. This is not a one and done thing. I mean, some of us might feel like we are in the worst possible position to finish well. We've done some things, we've made some decisions, and if we were to finish today, man, we'd feel like we're not in a good spot. The story would not be good. And I just want to say to us, there's always time to finish well. I mean, these are active words. He says, hate. Now, you know what that means. It doesn't mean hate, but this is active. You can choose to do that or not. He says, bear your own cross. That's something you can choose to do. He says, give up what you have. These are active words. And even if you've never done them before, you can start doing them today. You can build a different end of the story of your life. And Jesus is not talking about perfection. He's not even talking about our performance or earning anything. He's talking about how we relate to him. And if we've never followed him, by his grace we can start. And even if we have been following him and we've sort of wandered into listening to these other voices, to the people in our lives or the stuff that we have or even our own egos, these barriers, he said we can stop, we can confess, we can come to him. It's never too late to finish well. And you know who the perfect example of this is in Scripture? It's Peter. Because Peter at one point said to Jesus, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." Good job, Peter. Later on, Peter said, "Jesus, when everyone else leaves you, I'm not going to leave you. I'm going to be here." Good job, Peter. And remember what Peter said a little bit next? He said, "Oh, Jesus, all that stuff that you said you're going to do about you dying, that's never going to happen." And Jesus said, "You need to get behind me, Satan." And then we all know how Peter, at the end of Jesus' life, when he was on trial, 3 different times people said, "Hey, you're one of Jesus' disciples." And Peter said, "I never even knew the guy." And yet, Peter, even though he had these major failures in his life, I think we would all agree he finished well. He kept getting back up. He kept confessing and saying, "Nope, you're first in my life." And he kept living like that, and he finished well. There's always time. I want to show one last picture, and then we'll be done. This has to be my favorite picture of recent time here. Have you seen this before? This is a fantastic picture. This picture is old. Older than probably most of us in this room. This is the University of Michigan, and in the early 50s. They had a pretty nationally famous marching band, and this is their drum leader, David Smith. And this is early in the morning on a Saturday, game day. You can see by the shadows. This is early in the morning. And so he got up and he was going to go out and practice. And he's just out there strutting his stuff. And I think he'd be surprised to find behind him these 7 kids. This wasn't planned. He didn't get this group together and say, "Hey, come, let's do this." These are faculty kids who are on the swing sets or riding bikes, and they saw him out there and they said, "We want a piece of this." And when I see this picture, it makes me think of discipleship and what we've been talking about this fall. Hebrews 12 says that Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, for the joy set before him. Do you see the smile on his face? For the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross. And then there's us, this ragtag group of disciples behind Jesus, who are exhibiting some of the same characteristics that Jesus exhibited, who say to him, "Wherever you go, we're going to go. Whatever you do, we're going to do for the joy of following you." There's always time to finish well. One day, we are going to see our first love face to face. What a day that will be. Let me pray.